It started with a scream piercing the humid summer air, a sound so raw and desperate that it snapped every head on the busy sidewalk in its direction. Even before anyone could see where it came from, the force of it shook hearts and sent minds racing to conjure images of the worst. It wasn't the kind of scream that begs for passing sympathy. It was the kind that demands immediate attention, the kind that makes your skin prickle with the certainty that something is deeply, terribly wrong. This was the moment Angela Washington's life changed forever, right there on the corner of Pine and Arbor, in a place she believed she knew like the back of her hand. A block away, Angela had been standing with her phone clasped in her right hand, waiting for the crosswalk signal to switch from that dreadful red hand to the friendly white silhouette of a walking figure. She'd had an exhausting day at her volunteer shift at the local soup kitchen. Sweat pricked her hairline, and her body itched with the need for a warm shower and a good, long nap. But she also felt proud of how many meals they had served, proud of the people she had comforted with a small word of kindness. She was thinking about how she could do more activism, more volunteer work, possibly even a citywide fundraiser for the underprivileged. She was lost in these thoughts when the scream tore through the air. That scream was not hers. It belonged to a teenage boy, no more than 14, who stumbled onto the street as a police cruiser screeched to a halt behind him. The boy's hands were in the air, eyes wide with confusion and terror. Angela's first reaction was a kick of adrenaline that she recognized instantly. The voice of her mother, who had always taught her never to stand by if someone was in trouble. She sprinted toward him just as she saw two uniformed officers emerge from the car. One was stocky and middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair that seemed to bristle with tension. The other, younger, tall and wiry, looked uncertain. The older cop, the stocky one, pointed a shaking finger at the trembling boy as though he were a dangerous criminal. Angela approached carefully, conscious of the environment, of the protocols she had seen in news stories and viral videos that never ended well. The older officer barked at the boy to get on the ground, his voice crackling with the kind of anger that leads to rash decisions. People around them froze like a mass of silent witnesses, cell phones clutched in uncertain hands. Angela felt her heart pound. She knew these moments could turn lethal. And so, against every instinct that told her to keep a safe distance, she came forward. She held up her free hand, her phone still in the other, trying to de-escalate. "Excuse me, officer," Angela said, her voice unsteady but resolute. "Please, just tell him what he's done. He's just a kid." The older officer spun around to face her. His nameplate read Mathers. His jaw clenched, and for a moment his face twisted with barely contained fury. He looked Angela up and down, and in that fraction of a second, she knew he saw one thing: a black woman interfering. The other officer, whose name tag said Carter, flicked his eyes from the teenage boy to Angela. He looked uncomfortable, as though he knew something was off about the entire situation, but wasn't sure how to extricate himself from it. The boy was still on his knees, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. "Ma'am, get back!" Mathers barked, ignoring her question entirely, focusing instead on controlling the scene. He advanced on Angela. She thought of stepping back, but her feet held their ground almost by an act of will. She couldn't leave that boy there, all alone with no one to speak for him. "I'm not interfering," Angela insisted. "I'm just asking for some clarity. He's a minor. Please don't hurt him, please." She swallowed around a knot in her throat. Yes, she was afraid, but she had faced fear before. She was not new to confrontation, having grown up understanding that her mere presence, her skin color, could sometimes invite aggression. Officer Mathers' glare intensified. If a stare could incinerate, Angela would have turned to ash right there. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. "Now move along. This boy fits the description of a robbery suspect. And if you keep interfering, I'll haul you in for obstructing justice." At those words, Angela's mind flashed to every social media video she had seen in the past few years. She could almost predict the next horrifying step. She tried to remain calm, her gaze flickering to the boy. He mouthed something. She couldn't make it out. Perhaps he was praying or calling for his mother. A swirl of protective anger rose in her chest. She turned back to Mathers. "I understand you have a job to do, but please treat him fairly. He's just a kid," she repeated, her voice softer now, trying to find any note of empathy in the officer. Let's all stay calm. An audience was forming. Passers-by hovered on the edges with phones out. Some were filming, some were dialing numbers, family, or maybe the police station. The tension sizzled like an electrical short circuit in the thick, muggy air. Carter, the younger officer, took a half step forward as if to place a hand on Mather's shoulder, but froze in mid-motion. Mathers bristled, chest puffing out as he pointed to the prone boy. He's got the same jacket the suspect was described as wearing. He ran when we told him to stop. Looks pretty guilty to me. Angela's gaze moved to the boy's ratty gray hoodie, obviously a size too large and worn at the elbows. She knew the story without hearing it. How many teenage kids in the area wore gray hoodies? Dozens? Hundreds? She wanted to argue, but she felt the boy's terror thrumming in her own chest. She needed to be methodical, rational. She didn't want to do anything that would provoke the officer, so she took in a calming breath. Is there any reason to use as much force? He's cooperating now, isn't he? She asked gently, noticing how the boy was practically shaking, arms still raised. We can verify his name, his address, get a parent. Then came the moment that would haunt Angela later. Her phone was still in her right hand. She felt the device vibrating. Someone was calling her, but before she could glance down, the officer's eyes darted to the phone as if it were a loaded weapon. In a heartbeat, he jerked forward, attempting to seize her wrist. "Stop resisting," he yelled, though Angela had not moved. His voice carried a menacing edge that flared panic in Angela's gut. She gasped in alarm. The only thing she could do to avoid losing her balance was to twist her arm. Mathers, as though sensing the slightest tension, erupted. Within seconds, the boy was forgotten. Mathers had Angela pinned against the hood of his patrol car, pressing her face into the hot metal. The sting of burning metal on her skin made her eyes water. She heard outraged shouts from the gathering crowd, voices crying out, "She didn't do anything. And what are you doing?" The boy scrambled to his feet, fear plastered across his face, uncertain whether to run or to help. Officer Carter hovered uncertainly, looking like he wanted to intervene, but was paralyzed by the authoritarian presence of Mathers. Angela couldn't breathe. The combination of the oppressive summer heat and her body being forcibly pinned made her gasp for air. She felt Mathers fumbling for the cuffs. She tried to speak, but nothing emerged except a ragged choke. Her heart hammered. This is how people lose their lives, she thought. This is exactly how it happens. No chance to speak, no presumption of innocence, just a single, unstoppable flashpoint. She heard Carter's voice from somewhere behind. "Officer Mathers, maybe we should just... You want to get written up for insubordination, Carter?" She was interfering. Mathers shouted. His spittle landed on Angela's cheek. Her mind reeled. Interfering? By speaking in a public street? By asking for fairness? Distantly, she recognized that the phone in her hand was still recording. She had pressed record when she'd seen the initial confrontation with the teen. The phone was angled awkwardly, but it might be capturing the audio, at least proof that she was not resisting. In a frantic surge of effort, Angela managed to shift her weight just enough to keep from being completely smothered by the hood of the car. "Sir, I'm not resisting," she managed to choke out. "Please listen." But Mathers wasn't having it. He roughly tugged her arms behind her back, yanking so hard she let out a cry. The crowd was no longer quiet. People were shouting, "This is wrong," and "She's not doing anything." Angela's eyes squeezed shut. Her mind whirled with thoughts of her mother and father, with the uncles who told her to keep her head down in situations like this, to live to see another day. Rage flared in her chest, but she fought to tamp it down. Survival was a priority. Only when she felt the click of cold steel around her wrist did Angela realize the magnitude of what was happening. She was being arrested. For what? Obstruction? Interference? Or just daring to speak up for a child? Mathers forced her up, pushing her shoulders with such pressure that she feared they would dislocate. She locked eyes with Carter, silently pleading for some sense of reason. He looked away, clearly torn, but powerless or unwilling to override his partner's actions. Stunned, Angela was guided into the back of the police cruiser, her arms pinned at an unnatural angle. The last image she saw before the door slammed shut was the teenage boy being checked over by paramedics who'd arrived out of nowhere. The poor kid seemed in shock. Someone in the crowd tried to speak to him, but the paramedics were waving them off. Then the door closed, cutting off her view. The stale stench of vinyl seat and old cigarette smoke engulfed her. She felt tears threaten, but she forced herself to remain calm. Within minutes, the cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a throng of stunned witnesses. Her phone, somewhere between the seat and her cuffed hands, continued to vibrate occasionally with calls, notifications, messages. Panic built in her chest, mingling with anger and confusion. She had seen the scenario so many times, read about it, but it had never happened to her. She was a respected community volunteer, known for her local philanthropic efforts. She had never had so much as a traffic ticket. And yet here she was, the target of man's prejudice, a man whose uniform was supposed to symbolize protection and justice. When they arrived at the station, the booking process was a haze of bright fluorescent lights and humiliating commands. Mathers never once looked at her, except to scowl. Carter looked torn, still shadowing his partner. He flinched each time Mathers barked an order. Angela was allowed one phone call, albeit with difficulty, once they finally removed the cuffs from her chafed wrists. She had no illusions. She wasn't going to call a local attorney or a friend from around the corner. She had a far more powerful contact in mind, a contact whose number she had never dared to use in such a personal context. But the memory of how she'd gotten that number, and the promise that had come with it, flashed like a beacon in her mind. She used the station's landline. Her first call was to her mother, letting her know what had happened and to ask for immediate help. The second call, which she made swiftly and covertly before Mathers could intervene, was the one she knew would make all the difference. She dialed the direct number of an old friend who happened to be the director of the FBI. A year prior, Angela had organized a large fundraising event aimed at bridging the trust gap between local law enforcement and marginalized communities. She had been recognized regionally for her efforts, and the program gained national attention. During the event's culminating ceremony in Washington, D.C., she had met the FBI director, an older man with surprisingly warm demeanor. He had admired her passion and sincerity, and they struck up a conversation that lasted nearly an hour. Before parting ways, he discreetly handed her a business card with a personal cell number handwritten on the back. "If you ever need anything," he'd said quietly, "and I mean anything, don't hesitate to call. People like you are exactly what this country needs." She'd never dreamed she would actually use that number. But as soon as the phone rang on the other end, and that familiar gravelly voice picked up, a wave of relief cascaded over her. She whispered hurriedly, aware of eyes and ears around her, "Director, it's Angela Washington. I'm in real trouble. I was falsely arrested, assaulted by a police officer. I think my life might be in danger." The FBI director's reaction was immediate and intense. "Angela, are you safe right now? Where are they holding you?" She told him the name of the precinct and the circumstances as best she could in hushed tones, ignoring the suspicious glances from the station staff. There was a tension in the pause that followed. Then the director said something that made her entire body tremble, with a strange mix of hope and fear. "All right, don't panic. We'll get you out of there. Keep your head down. Don't talk to anyone until you have legal counsel. I'll make some calls immediately." He hung up, and Angela, swallowing hard, placed the receiver back in its cradle. A jolt of adrenaline shot through her, followed by a sinking wave of anxiety. She had no idea how the local authorities would react to an FBI director's sudden involvement, but as she was led back to a holding cell with a couple of other frightened-looking women in it, she prayed silently that it would at least provide her some measure of safety. Sitting on a hard, cold bench in that dimly lit cell, Angela's mind replayed the whole ordeal in loops. In a cruel stroke of irony, she realized the teenage boy might be safer now that the paramedics were treating him publicly, whereas she was hidden away from the eyes of concerned citizens and cameras. Nobody was filming in here. Her heart hammered at the thought, what if something happened to her? What if Officer Mathers decided to escalate? The hours ticked by in excruciating slowness. Her mother tried to visit, but was turned away with minimal explanation. At one point, a local public defender was summoned, but Angela insisted she was waiting for counsel from out of town, stalling until the FBI director's plan sprang into action, whatever that might be. Meanwhile, the charges being prepared against her were a bizarre laundry list: resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, and, shockingly, assault on a police officer. The last one made Angela's stomach flip. Assault? She had never laid a finger on Mathers. As Angela trembled through the night, she kept replaying that initial moment in her head, that split second where she stepped forward to help a child in trouble. She questioned whether she should have done something differently, something that wouldn't have ended with her in a jail cell. But each time she thought that, a flicker of righteous anger told her, "No, you did exactly what you should have done. This is on him, not on you." It was nearly dawn when the shift changed. Officer Mathers had gone home hours ago, replaced by a younger officer at the desk who occasionally stole worried glances at Angela. One of the female officers, with gentle eyes, came to check on the women in the cell. When she reached Angela, she paused as if recognizing her. "You're Angela Washington, aren't you? I saw your talk at the community center last month," she whispered. "I'm so sorry this is happening." She stared down at her shoes. I wish I could do more." Angela, exhausted but grateful for the show of humanity, managed a small smile. "Just do your job, be fair, and treat people right," she replied. "That's all any of us can do." Minutes after that exchange, the air in the station seemed to shift with tangible tension. The front door swung open, and in walked 3 men in suits, each wearing a pin that identified them as part of federal law enforcement. They were accompanied by local attorneys who looked disheveled and anxious, as though they'd been dragged out of bed. The entire precinct buzzed. Angela heard them asking for the commanding officer. A hush swept through the station as something monumental took place behind closed doors. There were raised voices. She caught fragmented conversation from the corridor. Unacceptable, violations, overreach, falsified charges. Then she heard the name Mathers, repeated in angry, accusatory tones. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and fear. She prayed the director's men had come to stand up for her, to see justice done. It wasn't long before the cell door opened, and a man in a crisp navy suit, flanked by 2 local attorneys, stepped in. With a polite but urgent gesture, he motioned for Angela. "Ms. Washington, come with me, please." She rose, trembling with relief, though her mind braced for any new horrors. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Walker from the FBI. The attorneys, one from the Department of Justice, the other from a high-profile civil rights law firm, confirmed they were working on Angela's behalf. Within minutes, the official booking logs were overturned. The watch commander, a lean man with sagging jowls, stammered apologies as he led them through the paperwork to get her released. Angela found herself walking out of the station, arms trembling from exhaustion, not quite believing it was over. A small crowd had gathered outside. Word travels fast in communities, especially when injustice is at play. Flashes from cell phone cameras lit the early morning gloom. Angela's mother rushed forward, hugging her so tight Angela could barely breathe. Tears she'd been holding back finally spilled. But the story wasn't over. Even as Angela was ushered into a waiting car by the FBI agents, she noticed Officer Mathers standing across the street, staring daggers at her. His face was twisted with fury. Behind him was a tall silhouette that she recognized from the night before, Officer Carter. The younger man looked at her with an expression of shame, so deep it reached his eyes. Angela felt a pang of pity, but she also knew that pity didn't erase wrongdoing. She sank into back seat, flanked by the attorneys. The car pulled away, the morning sun hitting her face, and she closed her eyes, inhaling the promise of fresh air and freedom. But a wariness clung to her. She might have left that cell, but the fight had just begun. Over the next few days, Angela discovered just how vicious the fight would be. While the FBI director ensured that federal eyes were turned on the situation, local forces loyal to Officer Mathers scrambled to cast Angela in a negative light. They leaked partial footage from the station's body cams, carefully edited to suggest that Angela had somehow lunged at Mathers first. A spate of anonymous social media posts appeared, claiming Angela was a troublemaker, even a provocateur. The local talk radio station ran a segment painting her as a radical who confronted a police officer in the midst of an arrest. Yet these desperate attempts to spin the narrative were swiftly dismantled by the full video from Angela's phone, the unbroken footage showing the entire escalation from the moment she arrived at the scene to the moment she was slammed onto the hood of the patrol car. Angela's sobs, the child's pleas, the crowd's outcry, it was all there, raw and undeniable. By the end of that day, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded, and in living rooms across the country, families sat stunned at yet another display of unnecessary force upon a black individual. Requests for interviews poured in. Angela felt torn. Her inclination was to remain as private as possible. She was still reeling from the experience. But the lawyers, the FBI agents, and even her own moral compass encouraged her to speak out, to stand not just for herself, but for the countless others who never get to show the world the truth. So she went public, with measured words and visible pain. She told her story on national television. She described her volunteering in the community, her attempts to reason with Officer Mathers, her fear of being pinned and cuffed. She stressed that she was speaking not out of malice, but to demand accountability. When the interviewer asked about her decision to call the FBI director, Angela hesitated. How many people would interpret that as a blatant use of a powerful connection? But then she remembered the vow he made about people like her being exactly what the country needs, people unafraid to shine light on injustice. I knew that if I didn't use every resource at my disposal, it could be my life on the line, Angela said softly, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. I don't want to imagine what might have happened if I remained silent. Sympathy flooded in from all over the nation. Even high-ranking officials began to weigh in, condemning the incident and calling for an investigation. But with the wave of support came a sharp undertow of hatred from certain corners. Anonymous calls to Angela's phone left threatening messages. Some label her a traitor to law enforcement, though her father had been a policeman himself for many years, retiring with honor. She tried to shield her mother from the harassment, but the sheer volume of social media attacks made it nearly impossible to avoid. Late at night, Angela would read to the vile comments, the sickening racial slurs, and feel a heavy dread in her chest. Not much had changed in the hearts of some people. The FBI launched a formal investigation into the precinct. The local police department placed Mathers on administrative leave pending the outcome. Carter, who had witnessed the arrest, was subpoenaed to testify about what really happened. Angela watched the news and found it surreal to see these developments swirl around her. She was grateful for support of her small circle, her mother, close friends, and the legal team, but the pressure of the public eye weighed heavily. She couldn't even walk to the grocery store without being recognized, offered hugs, or occasionally cursed by those who believed the spin that she was anti-cop. Her phone rang constantly, journalists wanting interviews, activists wanting her to speak at rallies, local politicians looking for photo ops. It felt exploitative and overwhelming, and she turned most of them down, focusing on the legal battle. She was filing an official lawsuit against the department for wrongful arrest and excessive use of force, in conjunction with a civil rights attorney who had built a storied career exposing systemic abuses in law enforcement. The city itself became a pressure cooker. On social media and in real life, neighbors argued. Some believed the evidence of the video was incontrovertible. Others dug in their heels, insisting there must be more to the story. Protests sprang up outside the police station, sometimes peaceful, sometimes tumultuous. Angela found herself the central figure in a conflict that represented something far bigger, the demands of community, indeed, a nation that had grown weary of a system that so often seemed stacked against them. All the while, Angela tried to keep her focus on the teenage boy. She reached out to his family and found out his name was Marcus. He was 14, lived with his grandmother, and had been simply sprinting down the street to catch up with friends when Mathers spotted him. His grandmother tearfully thanked Angela for intervening. Marcus himself was shaken, but valiantly trying to move past the trauma. "That could have been me locked up instead," he told Angela in a timid voice when they finally met in person. "I'm sorry you got hurt, Ms. Washington." She hugged him. "Don't be sorry," she said. "You're the reason I stepped up in the first place. You don't ever apologize for that. Don't let fear break you. We'll get through this together." The day of the hearing arrived. It was the first major legal step in Angela's quest for justice. The courthouse was buzzing with media personnel and onlookers. Supporters held signs outside the building saying, "Justice for Angela" and "Stop police brutality." A smaller but vocal group held signs proclaiming, "Support our police" and "Criminals belong in jail." That second group stared daggers at Angela as she made her way inside, flanked by her lawyer's mother and a handful of friends. Inside, the tension was palpable. Angela stood in the corridor, waiting for the hearing to begin. She noticed Carter standing alone near a water fountain. He looked up and their gazes locked. In that moment, Angela saw the weight of guilt on his face, and perhaps a plea for forgiveness. She gave him a nod, some small acknowledgement that he was not the villain, that at least he was here, presumably to speak truthfully. He nodded back, looking relieved but still tormented. The hearing itself played out in a manner that felt both glacially slow and heart-poundingly intense. Angela's attorney presented the video footage. Capturing the unprovoked aggression, Carter took the stand, and though he stammered at first, he finally confirmed that Angela had not physically resisted. He detailed how Mathers had escalated the situation far beyond what protocol demanded. Then, in a moment that stilled the courtroom, Carter confessed that Mathers had a history of racially charged complaint against him, though none had ever been sustained due to insufficient evidence or the intimidation of witnesses. Mathers, for his part, appeared furious, as if betrayed by his own colleague. He testified with defiant tone, doubling down on his claim that Angela had resisted arrest. That she had been yelling and grabbing at him. When confronted by the raw footage, his only rebuttal was to suggest that the recording had been doctored. The judge's cool skepticism was evident. Throughout the proceedings, Angela sat in measured silence, watching the slow gears of justice turn. She felt a pang of anxiety. Would the old pattern of denial and lack of accountability repeat itself, or would the truth prevail this time? Late in the afternoon, the judge announced that criminal charges against Angela were definitively dismissed, citing clear evidence of her innocence and the overreach by the arresting officer. Then came the statement that sent a ripple of gas through the courtroom. The judge directed the district attorney to consider charges against Mathers for false arrest and assault under the color of authority, an offense that could carry serious consequences. With that, the first big victory in Angela's struggle for justice was sealed, though the broader legal battles would continue. The possibility of a civil trial loomed, and the FBI's probe into the precinct had only just begun. Angela walked out of the courthouse amidst cameras and microphones thrust at her. This time, though, she didn't duck her head or hide. She stood behind a podium that had been set up for a press statement, her attorney at her side. Her mother hovered in the background, tears glistening in her eyes. "Today was an important step," Angela began, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "But let me be clear, this fight wasn't just for me. It was for Marcus. It was for every child whose life is endangered by the very people sworn to protect them. It's for every individual who's been unjustly profiled, harmed, or killed by institutional racism." Her voice caught and she paused. In that moment, the air seemed to quiver with collective empathy. Passers-by paused in the street. Even a few uniformed officers nearby lowered their eyes. "I was lucky enough to have connections and support," Angela continued. "Most don't. That's why the work must go on. We must hold those who abuse their power accountable. We must stand up for the voiceless. I call on this community and communities across the country to demand transparency, demand oversight, and demand real reform." It was a speech that would air on nightly broadcasts across the nation. People watched her speak with tears in their own eyes. Some felt emboldened to share their own stories of police misconduct, whereas others, perhaps those who had been skeptical or quietly dismissive, found themselves forced to reckon with the undeniable evidence laid out in Angela's case. She became a face for a movement, not by choice, but by a sense of responsibility to something larger than herself. The days stretched into weeks. Mathers was ultimately indicted, and evidence of his long record of misconduct emerged. The city's police chief, who had previously dodged the question of systemic issues, was forced to announce comprehensive reforms, including body cam reviews, cultural sensitivity training, and stricter penalties for violations. The FBI director, whose behind-the-scenes pressure had been instrumental in freeing Angela, publicly commended her courage. In a televised statement, he cited her as a catalyst for accountability. Through it all, Angela felt the emotional toll of being thrust into a spotlight she never wanted. She juggled the demands of interviews, legal depositions, and public appearances with the need to tend to her own mental health. At night, she often woke from nightmares reliving those terrifying moments on the hood of a patrol car. She sought therapy to help cope with the trauma, reminding herself daily that it was okay to feel scared, vulnerable, even broken at times. Yet in the midst of that struggle, she found glimmers of hope. Messages poured in from around the world. People saying they drew strength from her example, that they, too, would speak up if they witnessed injustice. Donations to her legal defense fund were more than enough to cover her costs, so she redirected the surplus into a new nonprofit she established, the Washington Initiative for Community Empowerment. Its purpose was to provide legal resources, education, and training to communities that frequently found themselves at the mercy of unchecked authority. In the following months, Angela worked tirelessly to build up this nonprofit. She hosted workshops, brought in speakers, some from law enforcement, some from civil rights organizations, some from community advocacy groups. She believed in bridge building, in forging alliances for the greater good. Not everyone wanted to cross that bridge, of course, but she refused to let cynicism overtake her resolve. There were setbacks and ongoing threats. Graffiti defacing her organization's office with racial slurs. Harassing phone calls at odd hours. Online campaigns aimed at discrediting her. Sometimes the negativity threatened to consume her optimism, but she pressed on, bolstered by the unwavering support of family, friends, and the countless strangers who saw hope in her journey. Marcus became a regular visitor at the center, eventually volunteering there. He blossomed from a frightened boy into a resolute young man who wanted to help others, especially peers who might encounter harassment or discrimination. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he told Angela once, his eyes shining with admiration. She tried to brush it off, but the compliment touched her deeply. As the civil case against Mathers and the police department progressed, more disturbing details came to light. Rampant abuses of power, cover-ups, racially biased policing. Eventually, a settlement was reached with the city, awarding Angela a sum that nearly made her breath stop when she saw the zeros. She accepted it on the condition that the department undergo a binding agreement to reform. There would be federal oversight, mandated community panels, and monthly public forums to track progress. Standing before the cameras yet again, Angela explained that the settlement was not a get-rich moment for her. Most of it, she announced, would go straight into her nonprofit. She stood at the newly renovated center, dedicated to providing everything from youth mentorship to legal counsel, staring at the group of press. "I've had enough of living in fear, enough of the next generation growing up under that same shadow," she said. "We have to break this cycle. Right here, right now." In the weeks that followed, Angela was at the center every day, helping with programs, meeting with local activists, forging new partnerships. The tension in the city slowly began to diffuse as genuine conversations about race and policing took place. Admittedly, it was far from a utopian turnaround, but small transformations sprouted, officers walking beats with community leaders, open forums where residents could share concerns without fear, a less adversarial atmosphere. It wasn't perfect or complete, but it was a beginning. One rainy afternoon, Angela was sitting in her office, finalizing details for an upcoming youth workshop. A knock sounded at the door. She called out a friendly "come in." And to her surprise, in stepped Officer Carter, dressed in plain clothes. He held a small bouquet of flowers, looking sheepish and uncertain. I just wanted to stop by and apologize in person," he stammered, clearing his throat. "I should have done more that day, but I was scared of Mathers, of the Department of Retaliation. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." Angela regarded him quietly. A swirl of emotions flickered in her chest. Part of her was still angry that he hadn't stepped in, that his hesitation had allowed for such brutality. Yet she also saw a man who was genuinely remorseful, possibly traumatized himself by the events he had witnessed. She sighed softly, gesturing to his seat. "I appreciate you coming," she said. Sometimes fear silences us. It takes courage to admit that. But you know now that silence costs lives. Next time, if there's a next time, you have to speak out. Carter nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. I promise I will. Mathers. He always had it out for certain people. I let it go because I didn't think I could fight the system alone. Turns out, no one is really alone if they just ask for help. Angela accepted the bouquet with a small smile, though a cautious one. Thank you. Before leaving, Carter handed her a sealed envelope. This is a letter from some of the officers who left the precinct in protest when Mathers wasn't fired after that day. They wanted you to know there are cops who care about doing this job the right way. Angela thanked him again and watched him go, feeling a measure healing, like a faint crack of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The letter indeed contained sincere words of solidarity, acknowledging the systemic issues and vowing to work toward positive change from within. Months rolled by and Angela's life, while transformed, resumed some semblance of normalcy. She still received the occasional hateful message, but they no longer held the same power over her. She was recognized everywhere she went, but the community mostly embraced her as a symbol of resilience and change. When she visited her old volunteer spot at the soup kitchen, the staff showered her with hugs and homemade cookies. She helped them expand their services, forging new ties with the city's resources. And in a full-circle moment, she spotted Marcus and a few of his friends volunteering there, ladling soup and handing out fresh rolls with shy smiles. Ultimately, Angela's lawsuit concluded with a landmark settlement and a consent decree that forced the police department to adopt stricter protocols and oversight. Officer Mathers faced criminal proceedings, and though his defense team argued everything under the sun, the evidence was overwhelming. In a surprising twist during the trial, a trove of past complaints surfaced, anonymous letters from fellow officers about Mathers' racist remarks and willingness to provoke confrontations. The final verdict: guilty of using excessive force and filing a false report. He was sentenced to prison time. The national media followed the case with avid interest, holding up as a beacon that accountability, while slow, was not impossible. On the day of sentencing, Angela sat in the courtroom, heart pounding. As Mathers was led away, he cast her a last venomous glare. She wondered if he would ever regret what he did. But what mattered more to her was that he would never again hold that power over another innocent person. That was worth every moment of terror she had endured. A quiet hush swept the room as the judge wrapped up the proceedings. The bailiffs escorted Mathers out. On the steps of the courthouse, the press clamored once again. But Angela felt a sense of finality. Not an end to her work, certainly, but a closing of one painful chapter. She stepped forward to address the cameras that day, the last time she planned to do so for a while. Her voice was calm, measured. "Justice isn't a moment," she said. "It's a process. This conviction doesn't undo the harm done to so many, but it sends a message that no one is above accountability. I hope that from here on, every officer, every citizen, will remember that we're all in this community together. We rise together or we fall apart." With that, she thanked everyone, her mother, her friends, her legal team, the FBI director who had answered her call in her darkest hour, and the countless individuals who had stood by her. She ended with a plea for unity, for continuing the dialogue that had begun. Exhaling deeply, she walked away from the throng of flashing bulbs, away from the jostling microphones. Her mother waited at the base of the steps, arms open, tears of relief shining on her face. Marcus was there, too, standing a bit farther back, giving her space. She reached out to ruffle his hair affectionately. "You okay, Miss Washington?" he asked. Earnest concern etched on his young features. She nodded, mustering a smile that was bright with promise. "I am, and I think we'll all be okay, eventually." In the ensuing weeks, Angela turned her attention fully to the Washington Initiative for Community Empowerment. She traveled to neighboring cities, sharing insights on how communities could demand transparency in policing and build trust through dialogue and collaboration. City councils and grassroots organizations invited her to speak. Colleges asked her to guest lecture on activism, civil rights, and the power of personal courage. Each time she stepped onto a stage or into a classroom, She brought with her the raw honesty of her experience, how in a single moment, your life could be upended by prejudice, but also how a single act of resolve can spark transformation. She didn't consider herself a hero or an icon. She considered herself a person who'd been thrust into an extraordinary situation and had chosen to fight back. Some people criticize her, some idolize her, but all Angela truly wanted was for communities to reach a place where nobody else had to endure what she had, where children like Marcus could run down the street without fear, and where honest officers like Carter could do their jobs without the shadow of their colleagues' corruption. And while not every day was a triumph, while many challenges and setbacks lay ahead, Angela felt something in her heart she hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. She carried it with her each morning, in the face of adversity, in the unstoppable forward march against bigotry. She saw it in the quiet gestures of kindness from strangers, in the whispered confessions of other victims finally breaking their silence, in the determination of a community that refused to give up on change. Sometimes, her father had once told her, the bravest thing you can do is keep going. Even when you're tired, even when you're scared, you keep going, because turning back isn't an option anymore. That was Angela's mantra now. If the cost of giving up meant one more innocent child pinned to the ground, one more voice silenced, then giving up was unthinkable. She would keep going, keep building, keep believing in a future where stories like hers wouldn't just be shocking headlines. They'd be extinct. And as the sun set on another day, she could finally rest with the unshakable certainty that she had stood up not only for herself, but for justice, and for every single person who deserved better from the system meant to protect them. In that sense, her story wasn't just her own anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever dreamed of a better world, who had ever felt the sting of injustice, who had ever dared to speak truth to power and call for accountability. It was a story whose ripple effects would continue spreading, driven by the unstoppable currents of hope, solidarity, and the unbreakable will of those who refused to be silenced. And above all, it was a story that proved, in the most dramatic and unequivocal terms, that courage in the face of wrongdoing can and will rewrite the future.